Suspecting his cleaning lady was dishonest, the millionaire left the office safe open. That night, while checking the cameras, he was frozen by what he saw. Lila took a deep breath as she stood at the gates of the mansion. The vast estate sprawled before her, with manicured lawns stretching far enough to meet the horizon. Eldon's mansion loomed tall and intimidating, all sharp edges and cold, dark stone. It was a stark contrast to the small, crowded apartment she shared with her ailing mother. This job was her lifeline, a chance to earn enough to help with her mother's medical bills. She couldn't afford to lose it. The front door opened as she approached, and an older woman with a sharp gaze stepped out to greet her. "You must be Lila," she said, her voice clipped. "I'm Mrs. Hargrove, Mr. Eldon's housekeeper. You're expected to start right away, so I'll show you to your tasks." Lila nodded, her hands tightening around the strap of her worn handbag. She had heard about Mr. Eldon. Stories about his wealth, his temper, and most of all, his absolute distrust of anyone around him. He had earned his fortune through some mix of skill and ruthlessness. Building walls that shut everyone out, Eldon didn't allow anyone into his life easily, and he certainly didn't offer trust freely. As they walked through the hallways, Lila took in the sheer opulence of the mansion. Marble floors, chandeliers that glistened like crystal, walls lined with paintings she suspected were priceless. It was like stepping into another world, and yet it felt cold, untouched by warmth or life. Mrs. Hargrove led her through the winding corridors, listing her responsibilities in a steady, matter-of-fact tone. "You'll be responsible for cleaning the main rooms, but stay out of Mr. Eldon's private office unless instructed otherwise. And," she added with a sidelong glance, "don't touch anything you don't need to. Mr. Eldon values his privacy." Lila nodded again, feeling the weight of the rules already pressing down on her. She understood that she'd have to tread carefully here. The silence in the house was so intense that every sound, every step seemed amplified. She tried to focus on her work, pushing away the slight twinge of nerves building in her stomach. After what felt like hours of dusting, vacuuming, and scrubbing, Lila finally took a small break in a quiet corner of the kitchen. She allowed herself a moment to catch her breath, her mind drifting to thoughts of her mother, the recent medical bills, the treatments. They were expenses that no one should have to shoulder alone. Lila had worked countless jobs to keep up, but nothing had paid enough to really ease the burden. This job at Mr. Eldon's mansion, with its generous pay, had been a stroke of luck she couldn't ignore. Across the mansion, Eldon sat in his dimly lit office, watching the surveillance cameras that dotted every corner of the house. He didn't trust easily. It was something he had learned long ago. In the bitter years of betrayals and losses, Lila was his newest hire. And although Mrs. Hargrove had vouched for her, Eldon trusted no one until they proved themselves. And even then, he remained skeptical. People always had motives, hidden intentions that only revealed themselves in time. He watched Lila move about the house, meticulously cleaning each surface. She seemed almost too careful, too mindful of every move. It made him suspicious, and his gaze narrowed. Eldon had encountered all kinds of people who would do anything to gain his trust, only to turn on him when they thought they had the upper hand. As the afternoon wore on, he kept an eye on the screens, noting every step she took, every slight hesitation when she entered a new room. At one point, she paused in front of the small study adjacent to his office. Glancing at the closed door, Eldon's suspicion grew. What was she thinking? Was she curious about his private space? Or was she already calculating her next move? Mrs. Hargrove checked in with him briefly later that evening. "She's a hard worker, Mr. Eldon. Quiet, respectful, and she hasn't strayed from her tasks. I think you'll find her to be reliable." Eldon barely looked up from his paperwork. "We'll see," he replied. "I've met plenty of reliable people who didn't turn out that way." "Keep an eye on her," Mrs. Hargrove sighed, nodding as she left the room. She was used to his distrust, having seen it over the years. But even she couldn't deny that something about Lila seemed different. Perhaps it was the quiet determination in her eyes, or the way she moved through the mansion as if carrying an invisible weight. Later that evening, after most of the staff had left, Lila lingered in the main hall, tidying up a few last things. She was exhausted, but the day had been manageable. As she turned to gather her things, she noticed something peculiar. The door to Eldon's office, slightly ajar. She hesitated, the faintest hint of curiosity creeping in. She knew she shouldn't, but something about that room seemed to draw her in. She could almost sense the secrets lurking inside, hidden among the fine wood paneling and expensive bookshelves. But she forced herself to turn away, gathering her bag and slipping quietly out of the hall. She couldn't afford to let curiosity get the better of her. Not here. Not with a man like Eldon watching her every move. Back in his office, Eldon glanced at the surveillance feed again, his gaze sharpening as he noted the momentary hesitation on Lila's face before she left. She had resisted the temptation this time, but Eldon's suspicion remained. He leaned back in his chair, a new plan already forming in his mind. If she was as honest as she appeared, she would have no reason to fear his test. He would leave his office door unlocked tomorrow, just slightly open, and see if her loyalty held under temptation. This was the only way he could truly know if she could be trusted. Eldon arrived early the next morning, his mind set on his plan. He wanted to see how far he could push Lila. In his mind, people were only as honest as the opportunities allowed them to be. He had learned that the hard way, and he wasn't about to change his approach now, so, after ensuring the cameras were functioning and positioned to capture every angle of his office, he unlocked his safe, leaving it slightly open, enough to tempt anyone who might be curious. As he left the office, he ran into Mrs. Hargrove, who was busy with her morning routine. "Make sure Lila knows her tasks for today," he said, keeping his voice low. "I'll be gone for the better part of the morning, Mrs." Hargrove nodded, watching him as he walked away with that familiar look of calculation on his face. She'd seen Eldon operate this way for years, always testing the people around him, setting traps to prove his assumptions. She often wondered if he realized how it affected others. But today, like always, she kept her thoughts to herself. Lila arrived soon after, ready for another long day of work. She greeted Mrs. Hargrove quietly and gathered her supplies, trying to remember all the details of yesterday's instructions. Today's list included the main living areas, the grand staircase, and finally, Eldon's private office, a room she'd been instructed to clean meticulously, but carefully. The mansion was quiet as she moved from room to room, dusting the edges of the furniture, polishing the mirrors, and straightening the knickknacks scattered across each surface. Her mind drifted occasionally, back to her mother, and the recent series of doctor's visits. She'd be lying if she said she wasn't worried. Medical bills were stacking up faster than she could pay them off, and even with this job's generous pay, she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, but she pushed the thoughts away. Focusing on the task at hand, finally she made her way to Eldon's office. The door was ajar, just as it had been the night before, and she hesitated, an odd feeling prickling at her skin. She hadn't been sure whether she was meant to enter, but Mrs. Hargrove had clearly listed it among her tasks. She knocked softly before pushing the door open wider and stepping inside. The room was grand, even more so than she had expected, with high ceilings and walls lined with heavy shelves crammed full of leather-bound books. A large mahogany desk sat in the center, littered with papers and pens arranged with meticulous care. And there, in the corner, she noticed something unexpected. The safe. Its door was slightly open, almost inviting. Her heartbeat quickened as she looked at it. She hadn't come to steal anything. Far from it. She'd never even thought about it. But something about the open safe filled her with unease. It didn't feel like a simple oversight. It felt deliberate, as if someone had left it open to see if she'd be tempted to peek. She swallowed hard and turned her back on the safe, choosing instead to focus on her work. Her hands moved quickly, wiping the dust from the desk, straightening the pens, rearranging the papers that lay scattered across it. Her fingers brushed against the edge of a photo frame, and her heart caught in her throat. It was a portrait of a woman, dressed in a simple yet elegant blouse, her face framed by loose curls, and her eyes bearing an expression of calm joy. She felt an almost visceral reaction to the photo, as if a long-buried memory was surfacing, but she couldn't place it. The woman looked so much like her mother when she was younger that Lila's breath hitched. She looked down at the picture, studying it closer, as her throat tightened. A sudden wave of emotions overtook her, and before she knew it, tears were rolling down her cheeks. She wasn't sure why she felt this way, why this picture of a woman she'd never met stirred up so much grief, but the intensity of it left her shaken. She carefully placed the photo back on the desk, her fingers lingering for a moment. Meanwhile, Eldon, watching from his remote screen, was stunned. He had expected to catch her attempting to snoop, maybe even open the safe if her curiosity got the better of her. But he hadn't anticipated this. He leaned closer to the screen, his expression hardening as he watched her grip the frame with tears streaming down her face. Why would Lila react this way to a simple photo? The woman in the picture was Marion, a name Eldon hadn't spoken in years. She had been his first and only love, the woman he'd lost touch with so long ago. To his knowledge, Marion had moved on, disappearing from his life without a trace. Seeing Lila react to Marion's photo this way made something in him stir, something he couldn't quite identify. Lila's shoulders trembled as she wiped her tears and resumed her work. She was careful, methodical, trying to bury the emotions that had surfaced. After finishing up in the office, she glanced once more at the photo before leaving, her steps heavy as she closed the door quietly behind her. Eldon sat back in his chair, hands clasped tightly together as he considered what he had just witnessed. What possible connection could Lila have to Marion? His suspicion had shifted from her honesty to something far more complex. He felt an unsettling need to uncover the truth, a gnawing curiosity that went beyond his usual mistrust. Perhaps, for the first time in years, his guarded walls had been penetrated, not by suspicion, but by a thread of hope he didn't yet understand. As the day wore on, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. His mind drifted back to his past with Marion, to the memories they had shared before life and circumstances had driven them apart. He had told himself long ago that his heart was closed off to anyone else, that he would never let himself care again. And yet, here he was, wondering about a woman he hadn't seen in decades. Through the tears of a stranger, that evening, he summoned Mrs. Hargrove to his study. She entered cautiously, knowing that Eldon's mood had been particularly sharp that day. "Tell me everything you know about Lila," he said abruptly, his voice low but commanding. Mrs. Hargrove blinked in surprise. "She's a quiet girl, sir. Hard-working. She mentioned her mother's illness, and I know she's taking on this job to cover the expenses. But other than that, I don't know much." Eldon nodded, barely satisfied. He leaned back, letting silence fill the room. Mrs. Hargrove, sensing his thoughts, chose not to ask any further questions and left quietly. Eldon remained, his gaze fixed on the closed door, thoughts whirling. Tomorrow, he would confront Lila. He would ask her about Marion, about the photo, and why she had reacted the way she had. He wasn't sure what he expected to hear, but he knew one thing. He wasn't letting this go. The night was unusually quiet as Eldon paced in his study, his mind consumed by what he had seen on the surveillance footage earlier. He couldn't shake the image of Lila, her face streaked with tears as she clutched the photo of Marion. The thought gnawed at him, poking holes in the walls he'd built around himself over the years. He had spent so long pushing people away, suspecting anyone who came near, that he didn't quite know how to handle the emotions rising within him. Eventually, he sat down at his desk, leaning back in his chair as he went over the pieces of the puzzle in his mind. What possible connection could Lila have to Marion? Marion had been his love, the woman he had thought he would spend his life with until fate had intervened, tearing them apart. He'd never known what had become of her. His family had kept their distance from her, and he had assumed she had moved on, but seeing Lila today had brought back memories he had tried hard to bury. He stared at the portrait on his desk, the image of Marion from all those years ago. She had been so full of life back then, so open and unguarded in a way he could never be. Looking at her picture now, Eldon wondered if he had ever truly let go. Maybe that was why he had never settled down or trusted anyone since. It was easier to stay isolated, to shut people out. But now, his curiosity was piqued. He wanted answers, and he wanted them from Lila. He glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. He would speak with her first thing in the morning. Until then, he had to keep himself from jumping to conclusions, though his mind kept wandering back to the memories of Marion and what might have been. As morning broke, Eldon found himself up early, unusually restless. He didn't know what he hoped to gain from confronting Lila, but the drive to uncover the truth was relentless. He needed to know why she had reacted to the photo and, most importantly, if she knew something he didn't. After breakfast, he waited in the study, listening as the faint sounds of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Lila had arrived to begin her cleaning rounds. just as she had done the past few days. Today, though, she sensed a certain tension in the air, a strange feeling she couldn't quite place. When Mrs. Hargrove finally showed her to the study, Eldon was seated at his desk, watching her intently. She hesitated in the doorway, her hands tightening around the cleaning supplies she carried, unsure of what to expect. "Come in, Lila," he said, his voice steady but with an edge that hinted at his seriousness. Lila stepped inside, her heart pounding. She could feel his gaze, heavy and intense, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Yes, Mr. Eldon." He paused, letting the silence stretch between them before he spoke. "Yesterday, I saw you looking at a photo on my desk. The woman in the picture. She's someone I used to know a long time ago. You reacted to it, and I want to know why." Lila's face drained of color. She hadn't realized he'd noticed, let alone seen her reaction. For a moment, she considered lying, but the weight of her emotions wouldn't allow it. She took a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "That woman, she's my mother," she said, her voice wavering. "Her name is Marion." Eldon's eyes widened, and he felt a chill run down his spine. The connection he had been dreading, and perhaps hoping for, was confirmed. Marion was her mother. He leaned forward, his mind racing to process this revelation. "Your mother," he echoed, trying to keep his voice steady. "How is that possible, Marion and I? We lost touch many years ago." Lila nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. She always spoke about a man she loved. Someone she had to leave because his family didn't approve of her. I never knew the details, but she talked about him as if he were the great love of her life. Eldon felt a sharp pang in his chest. His parents had indeed interfered, disapproving of Marion's background, her humble roots. He had been young and impressionable, and though he had tried to fight for her, the pressures from his family had eventually worn him down. He had convinced himself he was better off without her, that it was for the best. Now, hearing her daughter talk about Marion's enduring love, he felt an overwhelming sense of regret. "Lila," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I had no idea. I didn't know Marion had a child." Lila's expression softened, though there was still a guardedness in her eyes. "She never told you because, well, she didn't have a chance. After she left, she found out she was pregnant with me. She raised me on her own. But she never forgot you." The enormity of her words settled over him, heavy and suffocating. He could barely comprehend it. All these years, he had assumed Marion had moved on, never imagining she was raising a child. His child. The realization hit him like a blow, leaving him breathless. "Where is she now?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. She's not well," Lila replied, her tone soft and sorrowful. "She's been struggling for a long time, and her health has only gotten worse. That's why I took this job. I needed the money to help pay for her treatments." Eldon's hands clenched into fists. His heart ached at the thought of Marion, the woman he had once loved, now suffering while he lived comfortably. All the wealth he had accumulated felt hollow, meaningless in the face of this revelation. He needed, to see her, to make things right, if that was even possible. "Lila, he struggled to find the right words, his usual confidence shaken. "I want to help. I need to see her." Lila looked up, surprised. She had come to this mansion expecting nothing but a paycheck, and now the man she had once resented from a distance was offering to step back into her life, and her mother's. She could see the pain in his eyes, and despite everything, she felt a flicker of hope. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he replied, his voice filled with determination. "I owe her that much, and more." For the first time in years, Eldon felt a sense of purpose beyond his wealth and his walls of distrust. He had spent too long shielding himself, shutting people out, and it had cost him the most important things in life. Now he was willing to break those walls down, piece by piece. If it meant he could mend what was broken, he glanced at Lila, seeing a part of himself reflected back in her resilience, her quiet strength. He felt an urge to protect her, to be there in a way he hadn't been for Marion. He had missed out on so much, and he didn't want to waste another moment. "We'll go see her together," he said firmly, "and whatever she needs, I'll take care of it. You don't have to worry about the costs anymore." Lila's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. She had spent years fighting to keep her mother afloat, to give her even a small measure of comfort, and now, unexpectedly, the help she had needed was standing right in front of her. As they left the study, Eldon felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time in years, he was willing to take the risk. The drive to Marion's modest apartment was long and silent. Eldon sat in the back of the car with Lila, his mind a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't quite control. Beside him, Lila stared out the window, her expression tense but hopeful. She clutched a small bouquet of flowers she had picked up on the way, and he noticed how her fingers trembled slightly as she held them. It was as if she were bracing herself for something monumental, and he realized, in a way, he was too. When they finally arrived, Eldon hesitated before stepping out. The neighborhood was quiet, with narrow streets and worn buildings, a far cry from the opulence he was accustomed to. He felt a pang of guilt as he took in the surroundings. This was where Marion had raised Lila, where they had struggled all these years while he had lived in luxury, unaware of the life he had missed out on. Lila led him to the apartment, glancing back once to make sure he was still following. She took a deep breath before opening the door, and Eldon could see the worry etched into her features. For a moment, he reached out, almost placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, but then stopped himself. He didn't feel like he had the right. Not yet. Inside, the apartment was small, but clean, filled with little touches that spoke of Marion's presence. A vase of fresh flowers on the table, neatly stacked books on the shelf, and a quilt draped over the sofa. The air was thick with a faint scent of lavender, and for a moment, Eldon felt like he had stepped back in time. "Mom?" Lila called softly, her voice wavering. From the small bedroom at the end of the hallway, a frail voice responded, "Lila, is that you?" Eldon watched as Lila's face softened, and she motioned for him to stay back for a moment. She slipped into the bedroom, and he could hear the gentle murmur of their voices. Though he couldn't make out the words, he felt like an intruder, as if he were trespassing on something private. His heart pounded as he waited, and he found himself gripping the bouquet of flowers he had brought, his palms growing clammy. Finally, Lila reappeared, her eyes red but her expression calm. She nodded at him, giving him permission to enter. Eldon swallowed hard and stepped into the room, feeling an unexpected surge of nerves as he caught sight of Marion. She lay propped up on the bed, her once vibrant hair now streaked with silver, and her frame noticeably thinner than he remembered. But her eyes, those same warm brown eyes he had fallen in love with, met his, and for a moment he was lost. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of shock and something he couldn't quite place. "Eldon," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped forward, unable to keep the emotions from his face. "Marion," he replied, his voice rough with years of unsaid words. "It's been too long." Marion's gaze softened, and she offered a faint smile. "I thought I'd never see you again." The weight of her words settled over him, and he felt a deep pang of regret. He wanted to say something, anything that could explain his absence, but nothing seemed enough. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice thick. "I didn't know about Lila, about everything." Marion's smile faded slightly, and she looked away, her gaze falling to the quilt covering her. "I thought you'd moved on, that you'd forgotten about me. I was told it was for the best, that I wouldn't fit into your world." Eldon clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. His parents had indeed convinced him to let her go, to focus on building his fortune rather than on a life they deemed beneath him. He had let them control his choices, let their expectations shape his future. But looking at Marion now, he realized how much that decision had cost him. "I never forgot you," he said quietly. "Not for a single day." Marion's eyes filled with tears, and she gave a small, bittersweet nod. "I tried to reach out once, but by then it was too late. I had Lila, and I didn't want to disrupt your life." Lila, standing near the doorway, watched them with a mixture of relief and sadness. She had grown up hearing stories of her mother's lost love, never imagining she would one day witness this reunion. And yet, seeing them together, she felt a strange sense of peace, as if a piece of her own identity was finally falling into place. Eldon approached the bed, placing the flowers he had brought on the table beside her. "Marion, let me help," he said, his voice trembling. "Whatever you need, medical treatments, a better place to live, I'll take care of it. I should have been there for you, and I want to make it right, even if it's late." Marion looked at him, her expression softening. "You don't owe me anything. Eldon, I made my peace with the past a long time ago. My only worry has been for Lila. She's been carrying the weight of it all." Eldon's gaze shifted to Lila, and he felt a surge of guilt. She had spent her life taking care of her mother, shouldering burdens she shouldn't have had to bear alone. He wished he could go back, rewrite the past, but he knew all he had was now. "I know it's late," he said, his voice filled with regret, "but I want to help both of you. You've been through enough alone." Marion smiled faintly, reaching out a hand to him. He took it gently, feeling the fragility of her fingers beneath his own. "Then maybe," she whispered, "we can start again. A new beginning, for Lila's sake." For the first time in decades, Eldon felt a glimmer of hope. He had lost so much time, but perhaps there was a chance to salvage what was left, to be the man Marion had once believed in. He looked at Lila, who nodded, her expression cautious but open. After a while, Marion grew tired, and Eldon and Lila stepped out of the room, leaving her to rest. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding forming in the quiet. "Thank you," Lila said softly as they sat down in the small living room, "for coming here." "For everything," Eldon shook his head. "It's the least I can do. You shouldn't have had to carry all of this on your own." Lila looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and something else, perhaps a hint of forgiveness. "She always spoke of you with so much love, even after all these years. She never blamed you. I think she knew, deep down, that you cared." Eldon felt his throat tighten. "I cared more than I can put into words, and now I want to make things right, for her and for you." Lila gave him a small smile, and for the first time, Eldon saw a glimmer of trust in her eyes. They both knew it would take time, that there were years of distance to bridge, but as they sat together, bound by the shared love for a woman who had meant everything to them, they both felt the beginning of something new, a family, stitched together by the threads of forgiveness and hope. The days after their visit to Marion were a whirlwind for Eldon. He took immediate steps to ensure she received the best medical care, moving her to a private facility where doctors could tend to her around the clock. The weight of his decision sat heavy on him, an odd mixture of relief at finally doing the right thing and regret for how long it had taken Lila. Though grateful, kept a certain distance, watching him with caution, as if waiting to see if his intentions were genuine. One morning, Eldon found himself seated across from Lila in the hospital's small waiting room. Marion was undergoing a treatment, and the two of them had fallen into an uneasy silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Eldon, feeling the tension, finally spoke, his voice low. "Lila," he began, "I know I haven't earned your trust yet, but I want you to know that I'm here to help, in any way I can, not just for Marion's sake, but for yours as well." Lila looked up, her eyes guarded. "Why now?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with a hint of accusation. "Why, after all these years?" He took a deep breath, knowing she deserved the truth. "Because I didn't know," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "When Marion left, I thought she was gone for good, my family. They told me it was for the best. They said she was happier without me." Lila's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hint of bitterness in her eyes. "She never stopped caring about you, even when things got tough. She always spoke about you as if you were still a part of her life." Eldon swallowed hard, guilt pressing down on him like a heavy weight. "I wish I had known. I would have done everything in my power to be there for both of you. But my parents, they kept me in the dark. They didn't think she was suitable for me." Lila scoffed, shaking her head. "Suitable. She sacrificed everything for me. She worked tirelessly, doing whatever job she could find, just to make sure I had a roof over my head. She didn't care about status or money. All she ever wanted was a family." Eldon felt his face flush with shame. Hearing Lila speak about Marion's sacrifices made his own life of comfort and privilege seem hollow. He had been so focused on his career, on building his wealth, that he hadn't stopped to think about what he had lost in the process. And now, he realized, It wasn't just Marion he had lost. It was Lila as well. "Lila, I can't change the past," he said quietly, his voice filled with a sincerity he hoped she could sense. "But I can promise you that I'll be here for both of you from now on. I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me." Lila studied him, her gaze intense, as if she were searching for some sign that he was telling the truth. After a long pause, she nodded slowly. "For her sake," she replied, her voice steady. "I'll give you a chance, but just know that I'm doing this for her, not for you." Eldon nodded, understanding. He knew he couldn't expect her forgiveness overnight. He would have to prove himself, to show that he was committed to being there for them, no matter what. And though it hurt to see the distrust in her eyes, he accepted it as part of the price he had to pay. The days that followed were a series of small steps toward a fragile truce. Eldon visited Marion daily, sitting by her bedside and listening as she recounted stories of Lila's childhood. She spoke with pride about Lila's determination, her strength, and her resilience, qualities Eldon now recognized as a reflection of her mother's influence. One evening, as he was leaving Marion's room, he found Lila waiting outside. She seemed more at ease, as if the weight of the past few weeks had begun to lift. If only slightly. He gestured for her to join him, and together they walked through the hospital corridors, their footsteps echoing in the quiet halls. "Did she tell you about the time I tried to start a garden in our tiny apartment?" Lila asked, a small smile playing on her lips. Eldon chuckled, shaking his head. "No, she left that one out." Lila's smile grew. "I was maybe 8 years old, and I was convinced I could grow tomatoes on the windowsill. I saved up every penny I could find to buy seeds, and she helped me plant them in little pots. I was so proud, until I realized I'd forgotten to water them for a week." They both laughed, the shared moment breaking down a bit more of the barrier between them. Eldon found himself appreciating these glimpses into Lila's life, the moments he had missed, the memories he would have been part of had things been different. As they reached the hospital entrance, Lila stopped, her gaze thoughtful. "She's happy you're here, you know," she said softly, even if she doesn't say it. "I can see it in her eyes." Eldon felt his chest tighten with a mixture of relief and sadness. "I'm just glad I can be here now," he replied. I wish I hadn't let so much time slip away." Lila nodded, her expression solemn. "Time can't be undone, but maybe it doesn't have to be lost forever." Eldon looked at her, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. He reached out, hesitating before placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Thank you, Lila, for giving me this chance. I won't let you down." They stood in silence for a moment, a quiet understanding settling between them. Eldon knew he still had a long way to go, but he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. He was beginning to realize that, while he couldn't change the past, he had the power to shape the future, for Marion, for Lila, and for himself. The next day, while Marion was resting, Lila was sorting through some of her mother's belongings, organizing them in hopes of bringing a few familiar comforts to her new hospital room. As she sifted through the old, worn items, she came across a small, well-worn envelope tucked in the back of a drawer. Her curiosity piqued. She pulled it out, noticing Marion's handwriting on the front. The envelope was sealed, but she felt an unexplainable urge to open it. Carefully, she peeled it open, her heart racing as she unfolded the letter inside. The words were faded, but still legible, and as she read, her breath caught in her throat. The letter was addressed to Eldon. Marion had written it years ago, pouring out her heart. Explaining her pregnancy and the reasons she hadn't contacted him, she confessed her love, her hope that he would one day forgive her, and her desire for him to know his child. Lila sat back, her mind racing. Her mother had carried this letter with her for years, yet she had never sent it. She had chosen to keep her love and her pain to herself, to raise Lila on her own. Despite the challenges, Lila could feel the weight of her mother's sacrifice, her strength, and her resilience in every word. A newfound resolve filled her as she carefully refolded the letter, her mind already spinning with thoughts of what she would do next. For the first time, she felt as though she had a clear view of the journey that had brought her mother to this moment, and she knew that Eldon deserved to see it too. That evening, she approached Eldon, the letter held tightly in her hand. His eyes widened as she extended it to him, her expression solemn. "This is for you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "It's from my mother. She wrote it years ago, but never sent it. I think you need to see it." Eldon took the letter, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words, and as he read, his expression shifted from surprise to sorrow. The weight of Marian's words, her confessions and regrets, hit him like a tidal wave. He could feel the years of pain and love she had carried alone, the sacrifices she had made without expecting anything in return. When he finished, he looked up at Lila, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "For giving me this, for trusting me with it." Lila nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "It's time for you to know her story, and maybe to be a part of ours." Eldon clutched the letter to his chest, feeling a sense of peace and gratitude that he hadn't felt in years. He knew now that he had been given a second chance, and he vowed not to waste it. Eldon arrived at the hospital early the next morning, Marian's letter still resting in the inside pocket of his jacket. He had read it over and over again the previous night, each word unraveling emotions he thought he had buried long ago. The letter was more than just a piece of Marian's past. It was a reminder of what he had lost, and a testament to the love she had carried alone for so many years. Lila was already there when he entered the room. She gave him a small nod as he walked in, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Eldon approached Marian's bedside, watching as her eyes fluttered open, her gaze slowly focusing on him. She managed a faint smile, her face lighting up with a warmth he hadn't seen in years. "Eldon," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with a quiet joy. He took her hand gently, feeling its frailty but also its warmth. "Marian," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere this time." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she squeezed his hand as tightly as she could manage. "I never thought I'd see you again. Not like this." Eldon swallowed, unable to contain the surge of regret and sorrow that filled him. "I'm sorry, Marian, for everything. I had no idea. No idea what you went through, what you sacrificed. I was blind, and I let others make decisions for me when I should have fought for us." Marian shook her head, her gaze filled with compassion. "It wasn't your fault. We were young, and life took us in different directions. I don't blame you." "Eldon, I never did." He closed his eyes, fighting back tears. Hearing her words felt like a balm to wounds he hadn't even realized were still open. He had spent so many years blaming himself, regretting what he hadn't done, and now, in the face of her forgiveness, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Lila told me about the letter," he said softly, pulling it from his pocket. "I found it last night, and it broke my heart to know what you went through alone. I wish I had been there for you and for her." Marian smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to Lila, who was watching them with a mixture of emotions. "You're here now. That's all that matters." The three of them shared a quiet moment, a sense of peace settling over them. Eldon looked at Lila, and for the first time, he felt a connection that went beyond words. A bond that was deeper than blood. He knew he still had much to prove, but he was ready to take the steps necessary to be a father to her, to honor the family he had lost. As the morning passed, Marian grew stronger, her face lighting up as she recounted stories from her and Eldon's past. They laughed together, reminiscing about the days they had shared, and Lila listened intently, a small smile playing on her lips as she learned about a side of her mother she hadn't known. At one point, Marian looked over at Eldon, a playful glint in her eyes. "Do you remember that time we got caught in the rain during that picnic? We were soaked, and you insisted on making a fire with damp wood." Eldon chuckled, shaking his head. "I remember. I thought I'd be the hero and save the day, but I only ended up covered in mud." They all laughed, the sound filling the room with warmth. Lila felt her heart swell as she watched her mother and Eldon, seeing the love that had once connected them, a love that had endured through decades of separation. She could see how much they had meant to each other, and she realized that this moment was a gift she hadn't known she needed. As the hours passed, Marian grew tired, her eyelids drooping, and Eldon and Lila decided to let her rest. They left the room together, stepping into the quiet hallway, where they found a bench to sit on. The weight of the morning hung between them, a mix of emotions that neither seemed ready to break. "Thank you," Eldon said after a moment, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. "Thank you for letting me be here with her, for giving me this chance." Lila looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I'm doing this for her," she replied, though her voice lacked the hardness it had before. "She's always wanted you to be part of her life, even if she never admitted it. She deserves to be happy." Eldon nodded, understanding. "And what about you?" he asked gently. "Do you think you could ever accept me as part of your life too?" Lila was silent, her gaze distant as she considered his question. After a moment, she looked at him, her eyes filled with a blend of hope and hesitation. I think it'll take time, but maybe someday." It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. Eldon felt a sense of gratitude well up in him, and he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "That's all I can ask for." The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of healing and connection. Eldon and Lila spent hours with Marion, sharing stories, laughter, and memories, building a foundation of trust that had once seemed impossible. Eldon took care of all the arrangements, ensuring that Marion received the best treatment possible, and he watched as her health gradually improved one afternoon. As he sat with Marion by her bedside, she reached out and took his hand, her eyes filled with a warmth that made his heart ache. "Eldon," she said softly, "there's something I need to ask you." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Anything." She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "Promise me. Promise me you'll look after Lila. She's been through so much, and I want her to have a future, a chance to live without the struggles she's endured." Eldon felt a surge of emotion as he looked into Marion's eyes, understanding the depth of her love for their daughter. "I promise," he said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "I'll be there for her. I'll make sure she has everything she needs." Marion smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you, Eldon. That's all I ever wanted." They sat in silence, the promise hanging between them like an unbreakable bond. Eldon knew he had a lot to make up for, but he was ready to devote himself to being the father Lila deserved. He had spent too long hiding behind walls of distrust and isolation, and now, for the first time, he felt those walls beginning to crumble. When Lila joined them later, Marion gave her a look filled with love and pride. "You're going to be all right," she said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. "You have family now, and you'll never have to face anything alone again." Lila nodded, a tearful smile gracing her lips. She looked at Eldon, and he felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't known in years. They were building something precious, something that had once seemed lost, and he was determined to protect it. That night, as they left the hospital together, Eldon felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, that building a relationship with Lila would take time and patience, but he was ready to face those challenges, ready to be the father she needed. He glanced at Lila as they walked, his heart filled with gratitude for the second chance he had been given. He had spent so many years pushing people away, but now, with Marion and Lila by his side, he felt a hope he hadn't known in decades. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was home. The next few weeks brought a quiet rhythm of healing and adjustment. Eldon settled into a new routine, one that involved regular hospital visits, arranging Marion's care, and spending time with Lila. His days, once filled with the cold detachment of business meetings and transactions, were now enriched by conversations and shared moments that left him feeling both vulnerable and deeply fulfilled. Lila continued to watch him with guarded curiosity. She still kept a certain emotional distance, but Eldon could sense the walls between them beginning to lower, brick by brick. She had seen his commitment to Marion, witnessed his sincerity, and though she rarely spoke about her feelings directly, her small gestures of trust spoke volumes. One afternoon, while Eldon was reviewing some paperwork for Marion's medical care, Lila approached him in the hospital waiting room. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting as if she were unsure about what she was about to say. Eldon looked up, sensing the weight of whatever she had on her mind. "Mr. Eldon," she began, then corrected herself. "Eldon, I've been thinking about my future." He set his papers down, giving her his full attention. "Go on," he said, his voice gentle. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "My mother has always wanted me to go back to school. I had to leave before I could finish my degree because, well, I had to take care of her. But now that she's in a better place, I think I want to try again." Eldon felt a swell of pride, mixed with a tinge of regret. He wished he had been there earlier to support her, to provide the stability she needed to pursue her dreams, but he pushed the regret aside, focusing on the present and what he could do for her now. "That's a wonderful idea, Lila," he said, his voice filled with encouragement. "And I'd be more than happy to help you with anything you need. Financial support, tutoring, whatever it takes to make sure you can achieve your goals." Lila's expression softened, and he saw a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you. I want to study social work. Growing up, I saw so many families like ours, families that needed help, support. I want to be able to give back, to make a difference for people who might be struggling like we were." Eldon's heart swelled with admiration. Despite everything she had endured, she was choosing a path of compassion and service, dedicating herself to helping others. He realized that Lila's strength and resilience were qualities she had inherited from Marion, and he felt a renewed sense of responsibility to support her. "Your mother raised an incredible person," he said softly, his voice laced with pride, "and I have no doubt that you'll make a real difference." Lila looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "She's always been my inspiration, and I think she'd be proud to see us here, together. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for the chance to get to know you." Eldon's chest tightened at her words, and he reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "And I'm grateful you've given me this chance. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I want you to know that I'm here, for you and for your mother. Whatever you need, I'll be there." They shared a quiet smile, a sense of warmth settling between them that felt almost familial. For the first time, Eldon felt like he was truly becoming a part of her life, not just as a provider, but as a father figure, a role he hadn't known he wanted until now. In the following days, he took it upon himself to help Lila prepare for her return to school. He arranged meetings with advisors, helped her gather the necessary paperwork, and even took her on a small shopping trip to pick up supplies. It was a strange, new experience for him, yet one he found surprisingly fulfilling. Each moment spent with her brought them closer, dissolving the years of distance and doubt. One afternoon, as they were going over her class schedule, Lila looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "I was thinking," she began, her tone hesitant. "I know you didn't get the chance to see me grow up, but maybe we can start making memories now, you know." Eldon felt a lump form in his throat, and he nodded, his voice soft. "I would like that very much." And so, they began to create small traditions. On Fridays, they would visit Marion together, bringing her favorite flowers or small treats. On weekends, they would explore new coffee shops or bookstores, places Lila had always wanted to go but hadn't had the time or means to visit. These simple moments became cherished memories, binding them in ways that words couldn't. Marion's health improved steadily, and as she grew stronger, she became an integral part of their new routines. She would join them on their outings whenever she was well enough, and their laughter filled the small spaces they shared. For Marion, seeing her daughter and Eldon together, laughing and bonding, was a dream she had once thought impossible. One Sunday, as they were sitting together in Marion's room, she looked at Eldon with a thoughtful expression. "Eldon," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I want you to know that I'm grateful. I never expected any of this, but you've brought so much joy back into our lives." "Thank you." Eldon reached out, taking her hand in his. "The gratitude is mine, Marion. You've given me more than I deserve, and I'm grateful every day for this second chance." Marion smiled, squeezing his hand. "Then let's make a promise. From now on, no more regrets. Let's just live each day with love and gratitude." Eldon nodded, feeling the truth of her words resonate deeply within him. For too long, he had let regret shape his life, dictating his choices and isolating him from others. But now he realized he had the power to choose differently. As they left the hospital that evening, Lila looked up at him, her gaze thoughtful. "Thank you for keeping your promise," she said softly. He turned to her, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "I intend to keep it for the rest of my life." And for the first time, he saw the walls between them crumble completely. They walked side by side, each step a testament to the new life they were building together. A life filled with hope, healing, and the promise of a family they had never expected. The days passed in a gentle rhythm, and Lila found herself growing more accustomed to Eldon's presence, though he had once been a distant figure in her life, a name her mother had spoken about with a quiet sadness. He was now here, real and present, a part of her daily routine, and as much as she had been wary of him in the beginning, she could feel her guard softening. One afternoon, they found themselves alone at a quiet coffee shop in town, an unassuming place with worn wooden tables and a view of the bustling street outside. Lila stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting, and Eldon noticed her silence. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently, his gaze steady. Lila looked up, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. She offered a small, hesitant smile. "It's just a lot to take in. I never thought I'd be here." "Sitting with you like this," Eldon nodded, understanding. "I imagine it must feel strange. I've missed so many years, but I'm grateful for each moment I get to spend with you now." Lila held his gaze, her heart softening at his words. Despite the years of distance, the distrust that had once clouded her feelings was beginning to fade. She saw in him a genuine desire to connect, to make up for the time they'd lost. And though the journey was still new, she was finding a certain comfort in it. She took a sip of her coffee, choosing her words carefully. "Growing up, I didn't understand why my mother was always looking back, She'd tell me stories about you, about the life she thought you'd have together. I used to think it was unfair that she kept holding on to something that wasn't there." Eldon listened intently, his expression softening. "I didn't know. I thought she'd moved on, that I was just a part of her past." Lila sighed, stirring her coffee again. "I thought the same, but now I see things differently. I see why she held on, and I think she always hoped you'd come back in some way." Eldon felt a pang in his chest. "I wish I could go back and change things, Lila, but all I can do now is try to be here, to be present for both of you." Lila nodded, a small smile forming. "You are, and that's what matters." They spent the afternoon talking, sharing stories that bridged the years between them. Eldon told her about his own childhood, the pressures and expectations that had shaped him, the family legacy he had been groomed to protect. Lila listened, surprised at how much she related to his stories of isolation, of feeling the weight of other people's expectations. For the first time, she felt a connection that went beyond words. It was as if they were slowly building a bridge over the gulf that had separated them, one conversation at a time. The bond between them felt fragile but real, a tentative thread that grew stronger with each shared memory. As they walked back to the hospital to see Marion, Lila found herself glancing at Eldon with a new sense of warmth. She hadn't expected to feel this way, to see him as more than just the man who had left her mother behind. Now, he was a part of her life in a way she hadn't anticipated. When they reached Marion's room, she was sitting up in bed, her face lighting up as they entered. She looked between the two of them, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "You two seem close," she remarked, her tone teasing. Lila blushed. Glancing away, Eldon chuckled, settling into the chair beside Marion's bed. "We've been getting to know each other," he replied, casting a warm look at Lila. Marion's smile softened, and she reached out, taking their hands in hers. "This is more than I ever dreamed of," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "To have both of you here, together, it's all I've ever wanted." Lila squeezed her mother's hand, feeling a rush of emotion. She hadn't realized how much it meant to her mother to see them united, to witness the beginning of a relationship she had once believed would never be possible. Eldon leaned forward, his gaze sincere. "Marion, I promise you, I'm here to stay. I'll be here for both of you, for as long as you'll have me." Marion's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice breaking as she spoke. "That's all I need, Eldon. Just knowing you'll be here is enough." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, laughing, reminiscing, and sharing quiet moments that felt sacred in their simplicity. Eldon found himself cherishing each minute, each smile, as if they were gifts he had long ago thought he'd never receive. That evening, as they left the hospital, Lila felt a sense of contentment she hadn't known in a long time. She glanced at Eldon, who walked beside her in silence, his expression thoughtful. "I wanted to ask you something," she said, breaking the quiet. Eldon turned to her, his expression open. "Of course. Anything." She hesitated, feeling a hint of vulnerability. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if things had been different? If you'd known about me sooner?" Eldon's face softened, and he nodded. "Every day, Lila. I think about all the moments I missed, the memories we could have had together. But I also know that dwelling on the past won't change it. All I can do now is be here, to make sure we have a future together." Lila smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. She appreciated his honesty, the way he was willing to confront his mistakes rather than hide from them. It was something she had come to respect about him, something that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't expected. As they walked back to the mansion, she found herself imagining the life they could build together, the family they could become. It was a fragile hope, but it was there, a spark that grew brighter with each day they spent together. The next few days followed the same gentle rhythm, each moment bringing them closer. Lila began to see Eldon as more than just the man her mother had loved. He was becoming someone she could rely on, someone she could trust. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, their quiet moments together, and she realized with a sense of surprise that she was beginning to see him as family. One afternoon, as they were leaving the hospital, Eldon paused, his gaze thoughtful. "Lila, there's something I want to show you." Curious, she followed him to his car, and they drove in silence to a part of town she hadn't visited before. He parked in front of a modest yet charming house, nestled among trees and surrounded by a small garden. The house had an air of warmth and comfort, a stark contrast to the imposing mansion he lived in. "This was the first home I ever bought," he explained as they walked up to the porch. "I lived here before. Well, before everything changed, before I became so guarded." Lila looked around, taking in the cozy atmosphere. "It's beautiful," he nodded, a hint of nostalgia in his gaze. "I've been thinking about making this a place for all of us, a place where we can spend time together, without the formality of the mansion, somewhere we can call home." Lila felt a surge of emotion as she looked at him, realizing the significance of his words. He was offering them a chance to start anew, to create a place where they could build memories together, free from the shadows of the past. "I would like that," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. Eldon smiled, his expression filled with warmth. "Then let's make it our home, for you, for your mother, and for us." As they stood on the porch, the sun casting a warm glow over the garden, Lila felt a sense of peace settle over her. For the first time, she felt that she was part of something larger, something that had the potential to heal the wounds of the past. They would face challenges, she knew, but together, they could build a future filled with love, trust, and the promise of a family that had once seemed impossible. A few days after Eldon's promise to make the small house their new home, Lila found herself sorting through some of her mother's belongings. She had volunteered to help Marion pack up the essentials for the move, wanting to bring along anything that would make her feel comfortable in their new space. As she sifted through drawers and boxes, she felt a surge of nostalgia. Each item told a story, each photo a piece of their shared past. In the bottom drawer of an old nightstand, she found a small envelope, yellowed with age. It was addressed simply to Eldon, in her mother's familiar handwriting. Lila paused, holding the envelope carefully, as if it were something sacred. She had no idea what the letter might contain, but the fact that Marion had kept it all these years spoke volumes. Lila's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. She unfolded the letter carefully, her eyes scanning the words. As she read, her heart ached with every sentence, her mother's emotions and regrets spilling out from the page. It was a letter written from a place of heartbreak and love, written during the difficult early days of her pregnancy, when Marion had faced an uncertain future alone. In the letter, Marion confessed her love for Eldon, her heartbreak over their separation, and finally, the news of her pregnancy. She had wanted him to know, to be a part of their child's life. But fear, pride, and the memory of his family's rejection had stopped her from reaching out. It was clear that she had struggled with her decision, but ultimately chose to raise Lila on her own, never asking for anything, but always holding on to the hope that Eldon might one day learn the truth. Lila took a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes as she read the closing lines. Her mother had written, If fate ever brings you back into our lives, know that my love for you has never faded, and if our daughter should meet you one day, I hope she finds in you the father I once dreamed you'd be." Clutching the letter, Leela felt a deep sense of gratitude mixed with sadness. She knew that her mother had suffered in silence, carrying the burden of raising her alone, yet had never given up hope. And now, after all these years, fate had indeed brought them together. That evening, she approached Eldon in the small living room of the new house. He was arranging books on a shelf, trying to make the place feel like a home, but he looked up when he noticed her standing in the doorway, her expression serious. "There's something you should see," she said softly, holding out the letter. Eldon took the envelope, his gaze questioning as he unfolded the letter. His face softened as he read, his eyes scanning each line with a growing intensity. She watched as his expression shifted, first with surprise, then with sadness, and finally with something deeper, a look of understanding that only the years could have given him. When he finished reading, he held the letter close to his chest, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. He looked at Lila, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea. She kept this all to herself." Leela nodded. "She never wanted to burden you. She felt like she didn't belong in your world, that you would be better off without her. But she always loved you. She always hoped you'd come back, even if she never showed it." Eldon's hand shook slightly as he placed the letter on the table, his gaze distant. "I wish I could go back," he murmured, his voice filled with regret. "I would have been there for both of you. I would have been the father she dreamed I could be." Lila placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. "But you're here now, and she finally has you in her life. That's what matters." Eldon turned to her, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I'll make it up to her, to both of you. I'll do whatever it takes to be the father you deserve, and the partner she once hoped for." They sat together in silence for a few moments, the weight of the letter settling over them like a quiet, unspoken promise. Eldon felt as though he had been given a second chance, not only with Marion, but with Lila as well, and he intended to honor that chance with everything he had. In the following days, the letter became a quiet reminder of the journey they had taken to get here. Eldon's actions spoke louder than words. He continued to support Lila's education, attending meetings with her advisors, and even helping her select her courses for the upcoming semester. Each step of the way, he was there, proving himself in ways that went beyond any promises. One evening, while they were sitting together in the cozy new living room, Lila glanced over at him, her gaze thoughtful. "I read the letter," she said softly, her voice laced with emotion, "and I realized that my mother held on to that hope for so long. It was something I didn't fully understand until now." Eldon reached out, taking her hand gently. "I understand it now too," he replied, his voice steady. "And I want you to know that you're not alone. I'll be here, just as I should have been all those years ago." Leela smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time, she felt like they were truly becoming a family that had been separated by time, but was now united by love, forgiveness, and the hope of a new beginning. Their lives fell into a comforting routine, one that involved shared meals, evenings spent talking about Lila's studies, and weekends visiting Marion, who continued to grow stronger. The small house became a sanctuary, a place filled with laughter, warmth, and the quiet reassurance of togetherness. One weekend, as they were leaving Marion's hospital room, she looked at Eldon with a playful smile. "I think it's time for me to come home," she said, her voice filled with anticipation. Eldon grinned, his eyes lighting up. "I think you're absolutely right." They prepared for Marion's homecoming with excitement and care. Making sure the house was ready to welcome her, Eldon took it upon himself to arrange for everything Marion would need: a comfortable bed, a well-stocked kitchen, even a small garden area where she could sit and enjoy the outdoors. He was determined to make their home a place where she could find peace and happiness, a place where they could all start anew. On the day of her return, they welcomed her with open arms, guiding her through the house as she took in the familiar and new surroundings. Tears filled her eyes as she looked around, her heart swelling with gratitude. "This is more than I ever dreamed of," she whispered, her gaze drifting between Lila and Eldon. I feel Complete. Like we're finally together. Like a family. Eldon smiled, his voice filled with warmth. That's exactly what we are. That evening, they sat together in the cozy living room, the fire crackling in the background as they shared stories. Laughter and quiet moments of reflection. For the first time, they felt whole, bound together by the love that had survived years of separation. As they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, Lila felt a sense of peace she had never known. She looked at her mother and Eldon, and she knew that. Despite everything, they had found their way back to each other. They had overcome the odds, healed old wounds, and, in the process, created a family they could all cherish. And as the night wore on, Lila felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had her mother, she had Eldon, and she had a future filled with promise. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged, like she was truly, deeply loved. They had been brought together by fate, but it was love, forgiveness, and the courage to start anew that had bound them into a family. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they knew they would face them together, united by the past, present, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The weeks that followed Marion's homecoming were filled with quiet joy and shared memories. The new house had become a sanctuary for them all, a place where the burdens of the past could be set aside, and where they could embrace the future together. But despite the happiness that filled their days, there were still shadows that lingered, memories that hadn't yet been addressed. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Eldon glanced at Lila, his expression thoughtful. He had been thinking about the letter Marion had written years ago, and the weight of the regret he carried. He realized that, despite the peace they had found together, there was still a conversation he needed to have with her, one that he hoped would bring full closure. "Lila," he began softly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "I want to talk about the past, about the choices I made that kept me from knowing you." Lila looked up, surprised. She had sensed his guilt in small gestures, and the way he often fell silent when talking about their lost years. But she hadn't expected him to bring it up so directly. "All right," she replied, her voice steady but curious. Eldon took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "When I was younger, I didn't realize how much influence my parents had over my decisions. They told me that Marion wasn't a good fit for our family. They convinced me that I had responsibilities, a legacy to uphold. At the time, I thought I was making the right choice. But looking back, I can see how wrong I was." Lila listened quietly, her expression unreadable as he continued. "When I look at you and your mother now, I see everything I missed out on. I see the life I could have had. I can't change the past, but I want you to know that if I had the chance to do it all over again, I would have chosen differently. I would have chosen you and Marion." Lila's gaze softened, and she gave a small nod. "I appreciate you telling me this, Eldon. I think I needed to hear it, even if I didn't realize it." Eldon looked at her, a mixture of relief and vulnerability in his expression. "Thank you, Lila, for giving me the chance to be a part of your life now. I know it's late, but I hope that we can build something meaningful together. Even after all these years," Lila reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his. "We already have, and I think that's what matters most." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them filled with unspoken understanding. Eldon felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet acceptance of the past and the knowledge that, despite the mistakes he had made, he had been given a second chance. As the evening wore on, Marion joined them in the living room, her presence bringing a warmth that seemed to fill the entire house. She took a seat beside Eldon, her gaze gentle as she looked between him and Lila. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Sensing the weight of their conversation, Eldon nodded, a soft smile on his face. "We were just reflecting on the past, on everything that brought us here." Marion reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We can't change what happened, Eldon, but we can choose to make the most of the time we have now. That's what matters." He squeezed her hand, his gaze filled with gratitude. "You're right. I've spent so many years dwelling on what could have been, but now, all I want is to be here, with you, with Lila, to make the most of every day we have together." Lila smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she felt that they had truly let go of the pain and regret that had once weighed them down. They were free to embrace their present, to build a life together that honored both the struggles they had endured and the love that had finally brought them back to each other. As the night grew darker, they continued to share stories, laughing and reminiscing about moments that felt both distant and close. They talked about their dreams for the future, the places they wanted to visit, and the memories they hoped to create as a family. Eldon felt a sense of contentment that he hadn't known in years. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, building walls around himself, and protecting his heart from the world. But now, surrounded by the people he loved, he realized that this was what he had been searching for all along: a family, a sense of belonging, and the peace that came with knowing he was no longer alone. That evening, as they prepared to say goodnight, Lila hugged him tightly, a gesture that spoke of the love and forgiveness that had grown between them. He held her close, feeling the full weight of the moment, and he knew that he would cherish this memory for the rest of his life as they said their goodbyes. Marian placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with warmth. "Thank you, Eldon, for everything. I never thought we'd have this chance, but you've given us more than I ever dreamed possible." He nodded, his voice filled with sincerity. "It's my honor, Marian. I only wish I had been here sooner." She smiled, her gaze tender. "You're here now. That's all that matters." They watched as Lila walked down the hallway, her steps light and her heart full. Eldon felt a sense of completeness settle over him, a feeling that he hadn't known in years. He had found his way back to the family he had once lost, and he knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As he and Marian stood together in the quiet house, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance, a chance to love, to be loved, and to create a family that would stand the test of time. And as the night deepened, he knew that he would never take this gift for granted. He was home, in every sense of the word. The days that followed were filled with moments of joy and quiet companionship, each one a testament to the strength and resilience of their newfound family. The small house had become a true home for Marian, Lila, and Eldon, a place where laughter filled the rooms and memories were woven into every corner. One crisp morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, Lila found herself preparing breakfast, humming softly to herself. She had grown accustomed to the peaceful routine they had created together, and with each passing day, her heart felt fuller. She had her mother by her side, and Eldon, who had come to mean more to her than she'd ever thought possible. Eldon walked into the kitchen, smiling as he watched her. He had never imagined that something as simple as a shared morning could bring him so much happiness. He joined her at the counter, reaching for a cup of coffee. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice warm. "Morning," Leela replied, smiling back at him. "I was just about to bring breakfast to Mom." "I'll help you," he offered, and together they prepared a tray with toast, fresh fruit, and a mug of tea, Marian's favorite. When they brought the tray to Marian, she was sitting by the window, wrapped in a cozy blanket and watching the leaves fall outside. She looked up, her face lighting up with a smile as they approached. "You two spoil me," she teased, accepting the tray with gratitude. Eldon chuckled, taking a seat beside her. "It's only fair. You've given us so much, Marian. It's our turn to take care of you." Marian smiled, her eyes filled with warmth as she looked between them. "I never dreamed I'd have this. A family, a home, and both of you by my side. It's more than I ever hoped for." They sat together, enjoying the peaceful morning, the simple pleasure of each other's company. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding and a love that had grown steadily through every challenge, every shared moment. As they finished breakfast, Eldon turned to Lila, his expression thoughtful. "I have something for you." "Lila," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped box and held it out to her, his eyes filled with anticipation. Surprised, Lila took the box, glancing at him curiously. "What is this?" "Open it," he encouraged, a soft smile playing on his lips. Leela carefully unwrapped the box, revealing a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a small, intricate key. She looked up at him, touched by the gift. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you." Eldon's gaze softened, and he nodded. "It's a symbol, Lila. A key to our family, to our future together." I wanted you to have something to remind you that no matter where life takes us, you'll always have a place here, with us." Tears filled Lila's eyes as she slipped the necklace on, feeling the weight of his words settle in her heart. She reached out, embracing him tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Eldon, for everything, for being here, for caring, for being my father." Eldon's heart swelled as he held her, overwhelmed by the depth of the bond they had formed. He had spent so many years closed off, protecting himself from the world. But now, with Lila and Marianne by his side, he felt truly alive. Connected in a way he had never known before, Marianne watched them, her eyes filled with pride and love. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on Lila's shoulder. "You're both my greatest blessings," she said softly, "and I know that together, we can face anything." The day unfolded in quiet contentment. Each moment reinforcing the love they had built, they spent the afternoon together, talking about their dreams and the life they hoped to create. Lila shared her plans to continue her studies, and Eldon promised to support her in any way he could. As evening fell, they gathered in the living room, the fire casting a warm glow over them. Eldon looked around, taking in the sight of his family, his heart swelling with a sense of peace and gratitude that he hadn't felt in years. Marianne glanced at him, a knowing smile on her face. "You look like a man who's finally found his place in the world." Eldon nodded, his voice filled with sincerity. "I have, and it's because of both of you. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. A family, a purpose, and a chance to be the man I was meant to be." Lila reached out, taking his hand, her eyes shining with warmth. "We're in this together, Eldon. All of us." They sat together, the quiet of the evening settling around them, and Eldon knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. They had been brought together by fate, but it was their love and resilience that had truly united them, creating a bond that would last a lifetime. As they sat in the warmth of their home, Lila glanced at the necklace around her neck, the key a reminder of everything they had overcome and the life they were building together. She knew that the future held many unknowns, but she was ready to face them, with her mother and father by her side, and the love they shared as her guiding light. In that quiet moment, they knew they had found their true home, not just in the walls around them, but in the love that filled their hearts, binding them together in a way that no time, distance, or hardship could ever break. They were a family, strong, resilient, and united by a love that had endured against all odds. And as the night deepened, they looked to the future with hope, knowing that together, they could face whatever came their way.